My greetings to all the colleagues of Medanta Echo and Cardiology who have joined yet again on a webinar on a virtual platform. I can only apologize that the circumstances of this world have made us do that. So my greetings to all the colleagues, all the delegates who've joined in, and particularly greetings of the season, and wishfully 2021 hopefully will be another year, and that we will actually be seeing each other and not seeing only their eyes and behind the masks. With these brief words, dear colleagues, it's my privilege really to have three clinical scientists of great repute in today's webinar. The fact that I have known of them for many years, decades, is of course an important point. They have supported me in my vision all the time, whenever I've called them. But particularly, I want to stress the fact that they are stalwarts in their own right. They have done work, they have published work, they are clinical scientists. And in today's webinar, they will be speaking on CAD and diabetes. We should have actually far more interaction on diabetes and CAD because these are partners in crime. Dr. Iyengar, as you know, is a very senior person. I've known of him. I was saying we've even written a couple of books together. And he will chair this session, this important session of Medanta Echo and Cardiology today and tomorrow virtual platform. I also have great privilege to invite Dr. Anup Mishra, whom I've known for many years. We did the first work on flow-mediated vasodilatation in diabetic patients long ago. Hails from AIIMS, was a faculty there, and now he runs a very important Fortis CDoc, which is a center of excellence for diabetes, obesity, and endocrinology. Doctor, it's customary to describe everybody by the number of papers that they've written and the number of conferences they've done. But I can tell you, here is an individual who has touched lives of millions of people. And his book, Diabetes with a Delight, is truly delightful reading. Dr. Manish and I have traveled together through ups and downs for 2 decades or more. And we are the two people running the Medanta Division of Clinical and Preventive Cardiology in its whole department. And we've done some work together, but notably, Dr. Bansal has done amazing work of risk stratification for Indians. We always look at pooled cohort data, or we look at the Framingham study. Nobody has given the data for Indians. And he first gave that paper, and this was published in our journal. With this brief background, Dr. Iyengar, the floor is all yours, and you as our chairman will guide us through the next 45 minutes. Thank you very much for joining in.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi, for those kind words and very nice way of introducing the topic. And we'll start with Dr. Manish first, or Dr. Anup, who start?
I'm going to start, sir.
Yeah. So we have 2 topics of great importance as far as prevention of cardiovascular disease is concerned. So Dr. Manish is going to talk first on aspirin for primary prevention of cardiovascular disease in diabetics. Is it all over? So let us see whether he's going to attack aspirin more and more, or is he going to bail out aspirin. So the floor is yours, Dr. Manish.
Thank you so much, sir. And I also thank Dr. Kasliwal for the nice introduction and the opportunity to speak on this very important topic. The story of aspirin began in 1970s and 80s when many studies conducted in patients with previous myocardial infarction showed that aspirin was highly effective in reducing the risk of further cardiac events and even mortality. So aspirin became a standard treatment for secondary prevention of CVD. So naturally, therefore, there was interest in finding out whether the same benefit could also be extended to people who did not have established cardiovascular disease, or in other words, in primary prevention. So two large studies were planned in male doctors, one in Britain, known as British Male Doctors Study, and the other one was in the US Physicians Health Study. The British study involved roughly 5,000 doctors, and it was not a blinded study, randomized though. In one group, the physicians were asked to take 500 milligram aspirin every day. It was a very high dose that was used. The study did not show any benefit. On the other hand, physicians' health study was much larger, more than 20,000 participants, 45 to 73 years of age. They were randomized to receive aspirin 325 milligram every alternate day or a placebo, and they were followed up for an average of 5 years. This study actually had two objectives. One was to look at aspirin efficacy, and other was to look at beta carotene effect on prevention of cancer. So this aspirin arm was terminated prematurely because it showed substantial reduction in the risk of mitral infarction. There was overall 44% reduction in the risk of MI with aspirin. The other reason for stopping this study prematurely was that the event rates in terms of mortality was so low that the data monitoring and safety board felt that continuing this study even for another 10 years will not be sufficient to show mortality benefit, because mortality risk was very low in this population. But in nutshell, this study showed substantial reduction in the risk of MI, although there was no effect on mortality, no effect on strokes. The benefits were seen mostly confined to men above 50 years of age. So in younger population, there was no benefit. Subsequently, many other studies were conducted which showed conflicting results. And finally, we had another very large study, really nearly 40,000 women published in NEJM 2005, in whom aspirin 100 milligram every other day was used, and they were followed up for 10 years. This study did not show any benefit on MACE rates or MI, but showed benefit in terms of stroke reduction. So by now, by this study, 6 large randomized studies had been conducted in primary prevention setting for effect of aspirin. All these 6 studies were together analyzed by anti-platelet trialist collaboration, and this meta-analysis was published in 2009. 95,000 individuals were included in total. The analysis showed that there was 12% reduction in the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events. The risk benefit was mainly accrued through reduction in the risk of non-fatal MI. There was no impact on stroke, no impact on mortality, just overall 12% reduction in the risk of vascular events. The benefit was same in patients who had diabetes versus those who did not have diabetes. There was no interaction with respect to diabetes, so there was no difference. Bleeding risk, however, increased significantly. There was 32% increase in the risk of hemorrhagic stroke and 54% increase in the risk of GI and extracranial bleeds. And importantly, the patients who were found to be at higher risk of having ischemic events were also found to be at higher risk of bleeding events, something which we see regularly even in patients who are undergoing PTCA or AF when we decide about role of anticoagulants. So the meta-analysis basically showed that there was some benefit, but increase in the bleeding risk. Now, before we proceed further, I would like to clarify one other relevant point here, that is about the dose of aspirin, which has remained quite controversial. But this same group, anti-thrombotic trialist collaboration, also analyzed data regarding aspirin dose, and they included studies conducted in secondary prevention setting and showed that the optimum aspirin dose was 75 to 150 milligram. If we use higher dose, it only leads to more bleeding, no benefit. So that is the standard dose that we use for secondary prevention. In primary prevention, we use lower dose, that is 75 to 100 milligram per day. Now, coming back to the evidence with aspirin, after the women's health study, many other studies have been done. This is one such study published, conducted only in diabetes patients, 1,276 patients who had ABI less than 1. No benefit was found. There was another study published from Japan, more than 2,500 subjects with diabetes. Again, no benefit was found. So basically, all these trials do not provide us any clear answer whether aspirin is beneficial in reduction of cardiovascular events in primary prevention setting or not, whether it is diabetes or no diabetes. So with this background, to clarify this uncertainty, three very large studies were conducted and they all were published in 2018. First was this ARRIVE study, which included more than 12,000 individuals who did not have diabetes but were considered to be at moderate CV risk. In them, no benefit was found in terms of ischemic event reduction, but bleeding events increased. The other was ESPRI study, which included elderly above 70 years of age without previous CVD. 11% of them had diabetes also. They were recruited from Australia and the US. It was found that there was no effect on ischemic events, but bleeding events increased definitely. The third, which is the most relevant for today's presentation, is the ASCENT study, which recruited more than 15,000 subjects with diabetes, more than 40 years of age, so all diabetic. This study was conducted in UK. This study showed that overall there was 12% reduction in the risk of MACE events, which included TIA. Now, this is an important point because TIA was not included initially in the primary endpoint. TIA was added later to increase the number of events because it was found that the event rates were not very high. So if we exclude TIA, there was 8% benefit, which was statistically not significant. On the other hand, there was 29% increase in the risk of major bleeding in this study. So again, we come to the same finding that the risk of vascular events is reduced by roughly 10 to 12%, but bleeding events are increased by 30%, which is roughly 2.5 times the benefit that we see on ischemic events. So bleeding events are increased more as compared to the reduction in ischemic events. However, in clinical practice, ischemic events occur more often than bleeding events to the tune of 2 to 2.5 times. So effectively, for this absolute event risk, the benefit is almost same. Number of ischemic events prevented is almost equal to number of bleeding events caused by aspirin. The actual numbers differ according to the risk of having vascular events, and this analysis from ASCENT study puts this in very clear perspective. So here we have three groups. This is patients who had less than 5% risk of vascular events over 5 years. So less than 5% over 5 years basically means 10-year, 10% risk. This is 10 to 20% 10-year risk and more than 20% 10-year risk. So as we see, with increasing risk category, ischemic event rates increased. The benefit in terms of ischemic event reduction was same proportionately, but because here absolute event rates were higher, so absolute benefit was also more. Bleeding events also increase in proportion to the ischemic risk. So these patients had higher bleeding rates, higher ischemic rates, event rates also. So when we put all the numbers together, what we find is that in low risk individuals, more bleeding events are caused as compared to the number of vascular events prevented. In intermediate risk, which is 10 to 20% 10-year risk, or more than 20% 10-year risk, which is high risk, in them, more number of vascular events are prevented as compared to the number of extra bleeding events caused by aspirin. However, even in these groups, the difference is not huge, almost same. Some benefit with aspirin, but it's not earth-shaking difference. So therefore, it becomes very important to understand this and to involve patient in decision making, because the relevance of ischemic event versus bleeding event varies from person to person. For some patient, it may be more important to prevent an MI, even though the patient is willing to take extra risk of bleeding. On the other hand, there may be some patients who would be very we are prescribing aspirin for primary prevention. So now when all these three studies were also published new meta-analysis were conducted, including all the major studies performed with aspirin for primary prevention of cardiovascular events. This is one such meta-analysis published last year in JAMA. 13 trials were included, randomizing 164,000 patients. This is the data for all participants, diabetes and non-diabetes both included. What we see here is that there's 11% reduction in the risk of vascular events, and there's 43% increase in the risk of bleeding events. So it translates into number needed to treat of 240, which means we need to treat 240 individuals for 10 years to prevent one vascular event if we are using aspirin in primary prevention. On the other hand, number needed to harm is 210, which means if we treat 210 patients with aspirin for 10 years, we will cause one bleeding event more as compared to the placebo arm. So number needed to treat is higher than number needed to harm, which means there's more risk than benefit, although the difference is not very big. If you look at data only for patients with diabetes, we find the same thing. There's 10% reduction in the risk of vascular events, roughly 30% increase in the risk of bleeding events, number needed to treat 54, and number needed to treat to harm 125. So again, slightly more risk than benefit if we treat all diabetes patients with aspirin. So clearly, there is a need to further refine risk within this group, because just the presence of diabetes is not sufficient for treating a patient with aspirin. Within this diabetes group, if you are able to identify higher risk population, then that may be the population where aspirin may produce benefit. So following this theme, in 2016, the US Preventive Services Task Force published these recommendations, according to which there was no role for aspirin in primary prevention in individuals who were above 70 years of age, because in them bleeding risk is quite high and they don't have sufficient longevity to derive benefit from aspirin. Aspirin may be recommended in patients who are 50 to 69 years of age, provided their 10-year estimated CVD risk is more than 10%. So 10% threshold was recommended by this guideline for deciding about using aspirin. However, using this threshold also has some challenges. First is that over the years, primary prevention has become more and more effective. Today, increasing number of patients are taking statin. We are using higher dose of statin. Diabetes medicines have also become better, especially with the introduction of SGLT2 inhibitors that reduce risk of vascular events. There may be some improvements in the BP control also. So because of all this, the risk of vascular events is decreasing. And this is something which was seen in many studies. For example, ARRIVE study, which I briefly mentioned to you about. In this study, the patients who were included were supposed to be at moderate risk of vascular events with their estimated 10-year risk 17%. Although, however, the actual event rates observed was only 8.8%. Similarly, in MESA, predicted risk more than 20%, actual event rate only 14%. And similar findings noted in many other trials like DECLARE TIMI 58, which compared dapagliflozin with a placebo, or REDUCE IT trial, which compared an omega-3 fatty acid with placebo. So in all of them, it's been seen that the estimated CV risk is much higher than the actual event rates which occur in the placebo arm. So which means that if we use 10% threshold, whatever risk calculator we may use, if we estimate 10-year risk, the actual risk in that patient is going to be much less. So we need to go to a higher threshold for using aspirin. So that is one problem. And the second problem is that when we talk of these risk probabilities, we are actually talking of a group. We cannot precisely identify the person who is going to have the event. So for example, when we say 5% risk, it means that one of these 20 individuals is going to have event. Similarly, 20% risk means 4 out of these 20 individuals will have an event. But we can't make out who these patients are going to be, who will end up with an event. So to address this, we've been using different tools for assessment of atherosclerosis rather than looking at risk factors and relying on various risk calculators. And in this regard, coronary calcium score has emerged as a very, very powerful tool for accurate estimation of severe risk in any given individual. Many studies conducted in relation to statin have shown that if we use calcium score, we can better identify patients who are going to derive benefit from statins. Similar data has been published for aspirin also, and I would like to highlight two studies here. So this first one is data from MISA study. In this particular analysis, 3,500 participants were included who were all aspirin naive, less than 70 years old, because above 70 years, aspirin is not recommended, and they did not have high bleeding risk. High bleeding risk was defined as any history of renal failure, severe liver disease, concurrent use of oral anticoagulant, or uncontrolled hypertension, which means systolic blood pressure above 160 or diastolic blood pressure above 100. So these were the individuals who were analyzed. Their mean age was 57 years, estimated CVD risk 5.1%. This table shows event rates both for ischemic and bleeding. We don't have to go into all the details. This first row column is the most important. So in overall population, ischemic event rates were 3.5% over 10 years. Bleeding events 1.3%. So again, ischemic events roughly 2.5 times more than the bleeding events, or 2.5 to 3 times more than the bleeding events. Now, when we translate this information into number needed to treat and number needed to harm, we find these values. So here we have people who had ASCVD risk less than 5%, 5 to 20%, more than 20%. These vertical bars show number needed to treat to benefit the patient. This horizontal line shows number needed to harm. And these are all calcium score risk categories: calcium score 0, 1 to 99, 100 or more, and 400 or more. Now, if we look at this chart, in all the three groups, when calcium score is above 100, this number needed to treat is much less number needed to harm, regardless of the baseline CVD risk. Okay, which means that these are the people who will benefit from aspirin. On the other hand, when calcium score is 0, then number needed to treat is much, much more than number needed to harm, regardless of the baseline ASCVD risk category. The other study which I wanted to discuss is Dallas Heart Study. This data is published just a few weeks back, 2,191 participants. Again, similar population, free from ASCVD, all aspirin naive, relatively younger population of 44 years age. The previous study, MISA, had included only those who were at low bleeding risk. They excluded everyone who was at high bleeding risk. But in this, everyone was included, but they were divided in two groups depending on the bleeding risk. And high bleeding risk here was defined as uncontrolled hypertension, concurrent use of not only OACs, but NSAIDs, steroids, SSRIs, statins, antacids, antiplatelets, then history of peptic ulcer disease, cirrhosis, cancer, and CKD. When we look at the event rates, both bleeding event rates and ischemic event rates increase with calcium score categories, but the increase in ischemic event rates was substantially more as compared to bleeding risk. So bleeding risk also increases with higher calcium score, but not to that extent as the risk of ischemic events. In patients who were at low bleeding risk, this is for entire population, and these three charts are for people in different risk categories. So in this entire population, when calcium score was more than 100, low bleeding risk, prevention of vascular events was more as compared to increased risk of bleeding. So here there was benefit. However, this benefit was confined mainly to people who were in the intermediate or high risk category according to the baseline CVD risk. Patients whose baseline CVD risk was low, they did not benefit. On the other hand, in those who were at high bleeding risk at baseline, all calcium score categories, bleeding events were much more frequent as compared to the reduction in vascular events. So once bleeding risk is high, then regardless of the calcium score, we are going to cause more harm than benefit. When bleeding risk is low, then in patients who are at higher vascular events, in them they will be benefit from aspirin. And this tells us about the importance of using coronary calcium score for deciding about various preventive therapies, not just statin, but also aspirin in primary prevention. However, calcium score is not available at every place, especially in our setting, and therefore we have to rely on clinical risk scores only most of the times. When we use clinical scores, we Indian physicians have another challenge that we don't have any dedicated tool for us, which has been derived from Indians, and therefore we end up using one of the Western tools. So here I would like to highlight some of our work, which has shown that for us Indians, British scores like JBS3 or QRISK are much better as compared to American pooled cohort equation. And this is something which has been corroborated by other studies also from India as well as from the US. And all of them are showing that British scores are more suited for India. So when we put together all this information, what do the guidelines recommend? So this is the recommendation by American Diabetes Association for 2021. So published just a few days back. These guidelines recommend that patients who are less than 50 years of age, no other cardiovascular risk factor, aspirin is not recommended. In patients who are 50 to 70 years of age and have other CVD risk factors, aspirin may be recommended. In such individuals, we need to have a shared decision making. We should involve the patient in decision making. Aspirin is not recommended in individuals above 70 years of age, and in those who are 50 to 70 years but no other CVD risk factor, or younger people with multiple CVD risk factors, we need to individualize our decision whether we want to use aspirin or not. The American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association published their guidelines last year about primary prevention of cardiovascular disease. There they provide more objective details about aspirin recommendation. According to these guidelines, low dose aspirin might be considered for primary prevention of CVD in adults 40 to 70 years of age who are at higher ASCVD risk but not at increased bleeding risk. Okay. Aspirin is not recommended in those above 70 years of age, and aspirin is also not recommended in patients who are at high bleeding risk. So how do we define high CVD risk according to this? Patients who have a strong family history of premature CVD, patients who are unable to achieve lipid or BP or glucose targets with medications, and those who have significant elevation in coronary calcium score. High bleeding risk is defined by the same criteria as I mentioned earlier: previous GI bleeding or peptic ulcer disease, CKD, concurrent use of drugs that increase the risk of bleeding, age above 70 years, male gender also, CKD. So basically, we should not prescribe aspirin to these individuals whose blood pressure is uncontrolled or those who have these risk factors. And even then, every guideline emphasizes on shared decision making, which means that we need to involve patient in decision making. So today, if we have to prescribe aspirin for primary prevention, these are the 5 questions that we need to answer. Is the patient 40 to 70 years old? In younger or older individuals, aspirin has no role. Does the patient have a high burden of CV risk factors and ASCVD risk enhancers based on clinical judgment or objective tools like calcium score? Is the bleeding risk low? Is the patient informed that the aspirin only has modest benefit in reducing the risk of vascular events, no mortality benefit, and will increase bleeding risk? And also, does the patient favor ASCVD prevention over bleeding risk that may occur? If answer to all these questions is yes, only then we should prescribe aspirin. If answer to any of this question is no, then we should not prescribe aspirin. So to summarize, the data shows that in overall population, when aspirin is used for primary prevention, the balance is slightly tilted towards greater risk than benefit. If the bleeding risk is high, then this balance is tilted further towards greater risk, and aspirin is definitely not recommended. However, if bleeding risk is low and ischemic risk is high, then aspirin has some benefit, although this benefit is not huge. And because this benefit is not that big, we need to involve patient in decision making. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manish, for that excellent presentation, clarifying a lot of our doubts. Do we take up questions now or at the end of the session? Dr. Manish, should we take up questions now or?
You can you can take questions now
Okay.
till Dr. Anup Mishra joins us.
Okay.
So it'll be nice to.
Yeah. So I think what you finally told us that you have to individualize the treatment as far as using aspirin is concerned in primary prevention. Now, there are also a lot of other things that are coming about aspirin that increasing the, aspirin also came out for prevention of cancers in some of the colorectal cancer. But now research show that it increases the risk of, probably promotes progression of cancer in the later stages. So there are a lot of debates about using aspirin in this. Another thing is as you rightly said, we have to individualize the treatment. One good tool is coronary calcium score. So if that is high, then again you weigh ischemic risk versus bleeding risk and use it. But would you like to also mention about the use of PPI, the proton pump inhibitors along with aspirin? Because the problem is mostly gastrointestinal hemorrhage. When it comes to intracranial hemorrhage, the number needed to harm is very large, 1 in 1,000. So I think using proton pump inhibitors also should be a part of your practice.
Possibly yes, although the guidelines don't make any specific recommendation about it. But yes, we know that aspirin, the main risk with aspirin is GI bleed. Enteric-coated aspirin reduces that risk, but still PPI may be justified, but at the same time, PPI, long-term usage of PPI itself is associated with some concerns about risk. So it's going to be very controversial, sir.
Are there any questions in the chat box?
Manish, I have a question.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. First of all, wonderful lecture. And second thing is, you said when there is a CRF, there is increased risk of bleeding and we are unable to give aspirin in that situation. But CRF itself, early CRF itself is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So how do we reconcile to that?
Yes, sir. In CKD, the rationale is that the increase in bleeding risk is much more than the benefit increase in the risk of ischemic events. And we are using other therapies also like statin, which reduce the risk of vascular events. So overall, the balance may not be in favor of using aspirin. Although there's no dedicated study looking at this, all have been subgroup analysis of the large studies.
I think there are some more coming out with aspirin primary prevention. Probably they will tell us more about it.
Which one, sir?
Well, some more studies on aspirin and primary prevention.
There are some more currently underway. Yes, sir.
So that might tell us more. And till then, I think you have to practice so-called precision medicine or individualized therapy, weighing the risk of ischemia versus bleeding.
Yes, sir. And also, I would just like to make one point here that we very commonly see prescriptions of aspirin statin combination in patients who have hypertension. Only risk factor is hypertension, and the patient are immediately put on aspirin statin combination. So this is a practice which must be abandoned immediately, because hypertension alone is not sufficiently high risk event to warrant aspirin, but bleeding risk is substantially increased.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. And as you rightly said, we should also look at the other factors which increase the risk of bleeding. Like
yes, sir.
Control of blood pressure and drug interactions, other SAIDs, all those things should be kept in mind.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes.
Triangle, if Dr. Anup Mishra is there, we can join. You can ask him to.
Good afternoon, Dr. Anup, sir. We go on to the next topic, another important topic when it comes to prevention in cardiovascular and diabetes field. Dr. Anup Mishra is going to tell us about the difficult phenotype for prevention of diabetes mellitus, focus on pre-diabetes. Dr. Anup Mishra.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for chairing this session. Thank you, Dr. Kasliwal, for inviting me for this wonderful session. I'll just share my slide. Just one moment. Okay. So the topic I was given to me was pre-diabetes, but I thought that much more is important to be discussed within this topic of pre-diabetes. No doubt, pre-diabetes itself is important and a lecture could be dedicated wholly to this, but I have just diverted a bit and because there are problems when we approach patients with pre-diabetes with intervention. Now, one thing, I'll start with a couple of things which are very commonly known, but still it may not be a bad idea to recap on these. Pre-diabetes is pathological. Everybody knows now in the doctors community, but just to share first how it starts and then how it is pathological. This diagram is known to most of the diabetologists. It shows that this is the area when pre-diabetes is occurring in an individual, where fasting blood glucose is going high and the postprandial is also going high. And when it crosses the threshold, then patient is known to be having diabetes. Behind that is insulin resistance and the insulin response, which insulin resistance increases initially, and then insulin response also increases. And when it starts going down, the blood sugar goes up. The most common cause is obesity, and there's compounded by physical inactivity and genetics. And I suppose Indian population has all of this. So this is the threshold where pre-diabetes is diagnosed, and this is the threshold where diabetes is diagnosed. Now, what is pre-diabetes? Pre-diabetes is, there are two components. One is impaired fasting glucose, and the other is impaired glucose tolerance. So based on fasting blood glucose, the criteria of pre-diabetes is more than 100 to less than 126. This is the gray area. And I would perhaps not diagnose pre-diabetes based on one value, and I will always go ahead if a fasting blood glucose is slightly high to do an oral glucose tolerance test with 75 grams oral glucose. And 2 hours later, if I also find that the blood glucose is between 140 to 199, then I'm quite certain, but each component may differ. Sometimes only impaired fasting blood glucose may occur, and sometimes only impaired glucose tolerance will occur, and sometimes both occur. Now, this is the type of graph we see when we plot it against normal glucose tolerance test, impaired glucose tolerance, new diabetes and previous diabetes as far as the cardiovascular disease is concerned. And so it is now very well known that the patient with pre-diabetes has a high cardiovascular risk. And there are many more things occurring in the pre-diabetes. I'm not going to discuss that. That they may develop neuropathy also, some may develop retinopathy also. So actually, pre-diabetes is not at all enough cause, and apart from large vessel disease, micro vessel disease also may occur in these patients. Now, prevention of pre-diabetes to diabetes journey, that is a crux of the problem for prevention of diabetes. And most of the workers in this area have tried to prevent diabetes when the patient has become pre-diabetic. And one of the most important studies and one of the longest lasting studies is the diabetes prevention program. Now here, patients were followed up to 4 years. There were 3 arms: placebo, metformin, and lifestyle. They're all very well supervised, very controlled study, one of the best studies performed in this area so far. And cumulative incidence of diabetes is given on the left side, and you will see very well that lifestyle prevented diabetes patients with pre-diabetes to convert to diabetes by 58%. So it trumped metformin and of course placebo. This is the Indian Diabetes Prevention Program. The study was published in 2006 by Ramachandran, and where lower dose of metformin was used. And you can see the controls had higher incidence of diabetes, and there was hardly any difference between lifestyle versus metformin versus those who had metformin and lifestyle. Continuing on to diabetes prevention program, a 15-year study of the same was published in 2015. Now this study is essentially showing all the three arms which are initially given. But after 4 years, the study was not controlled. And the patients were told to go to their respective physicians and managed as per physician's advice. But look at that. Even after 15 years, the lifestyle still is preventing diabetes, although the difference between metformin and lifestyle is closing now. Now, remember, these patients were initially given metformin and then subsequently not given, or subsequently were given or not given depending on the physician's advice. And placebo these people continue to have a high incidence. So it's a long-term benefit of lifestyle. And this is my editorial in the issue of Lancet, that in each setting, in each country, in each ethnic group, we must have our own data. So all these studies clearly indicated that lifestyle still is the best, and that metformin can be used and it has some benefit, and over a period of time, benefit of lifestyle and metformin, they are lesser, the difference is lesser. Now, there are certain phenotypes or genotypes which may impede prevention of diabetes from pre-diabetes. These are the things that a clinician often encounters. Well, we have given the same advice for lifestyle to a group of people and it is working well, and same advice to another group of people and it is not working well. Now, there could be some reasons behind it. One reason is our own ethnicity. Clearly, and this has been very well illustrated by an article by my friend Naveed Sattar in Lancet. Now look at this. This is the curve for glycemia. On the left side is curve in Indian population, Asian Indian population, and right side is curve for white Caucasian. When diabetes occurs, it's separated by 10 years at least. So younger occurrence of diabetes in younger people versus older people. But that is not important. Important is the rate of conversion from pre-diabetes to diabetes, which is 12 to 18% per year in Indian people, and half of that, 5 to 11% per year in Western population. So we have double the rate of progression. And if the same amount of lifestyle intervention, similar advice is given to both people, then the pre-diabetes to normal glucose conversion occurs only in 30% of the patients who are Indians versus more than 50% in the Western population. So there is a clear-cut obstacle to intervention, effectiveness of intervention in Indian people for conversion of pre-diabetes to normal glucose regulation. Age is a clear determinant. And there are a number of studies, but I'll show you one study. And this is the, again, data taken from Diabetes Prevention Program. And if you look at this, 25 to 44 years of age, 45 to 59 years of age, and more than 60 years of age, and lifestyle, metformin versus placebo, and cases per 100 per person year. And look at that. That the lifestyle is effective in all, but perhaps more in 60 years of more than 60 years of age. But what is not very effective in more than 60 years of age is metformin. This is very interesting differential as far as the more than 60 years age of people are concerned. So we would like to give metformin in these people if indicated, and may rely more on lifestyle in those who are more than 60 years of age. Non-obese individuals are likely to have low insulin reserve or low insulin secretor. Now, this is something which is often known but not substantiated in at least in Indian population. Now, if you look at this, Indian population has hyperglycemia at very BMI, starting 1920 many more times than other ethnic groups, Japanese, Maltese, European, or Chinese. Look at this. This prevalence of diabetes, and in fact, after 27 BMI, it becomes static. So whatever is happening is between 21, 22 BMI to 27 BMI, both in men and in women. And these so-called non-obese phenotype have low insulin reserve. So this is what we are talking about. And if you look at this, these are some of the initial studies on insulin secretion, beta cell mass, from autopsy studies in obese and lean subjects. If you look at these are non-diabetic impaired fasting glucose, type 2 diabetes, beta cell volume in obese people versus lean people. To begin with, lean people have lesser beta cell volume. So this may be applicable for Indian population that they have lesser beta cell volume, although such studies in autopsy have not been performed in Indian population. Another factor of importance is early remission of prediabetes. Now, suppose we start with a lifestyle intervention or give metformin, and patient does not remit or does not go into normal glucose regulation versus somebody who goes into the normal glucose regulation pretty early. That means this person is sensitive to lifestyle or metformin. Look at this. Now, regression from pre-diabetes to normal glucose regulation is associated with long-term reduction in diabetes risk. So these are the people who never reached normal glucose regulation in diabetes prevention program. And these are the people who reached at least once. So they may become normal and then go back, but at least their chances of going to diabetes is much less than those who are. So this is a very important observation. This is all observation from a single study. Look at the brilliance of that study. The number of observations have occurred which we can apply in the clinical practice. Another area of a prime importance and is liver. And the importance of this is growing day by day. And we have done a number of studies in on the liver, fatty liver, and Indian population. And we are intrigued that liver is something which is perhaps most affected organ in the body, ahead of kidney or heart, as far as diabetic patient is concerned. But here we are talking about that if there is a good amount of fat in the liver, then not only it predicts diabetes, but impedes regression to normal glucose regulation from pre-diabetes. Now, presence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease alone predicts diabetes, and this is our study. This normal liver, the liver span is around 11 centimeter here, and liver span is around 20 centimeter here. So these are something which are differentiate vastly differentiate normal versus the grade 2 or 3 fatty liver. This is what we see daily in patients with diabetes. But what is more important is that if we have a liver span cutoff in a so-called normal person at 15.6, any person with a liver span cutoff more than 15.6, suppose we are doing some ultrasound in normal people and we find that their liver is 17 centimeters, the risk of diabetes is very high. So this is what we published some time back, that this is the cutoff for liver span for prediction of diabetes. But what we are talking about is this. This is a beautiful study in Diabetologia in 2015. They identified a high-risk phenotype where they looked at insulin resistance plus non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and low-risk phenotype where there are all other traits, whatever other traits. Now look at this. 9 months of lifestyle intervention, the fat loss, the postprandial glucose, and reversal to normal glucose tolerance, all were low if there is a presence of non-alcoholic fatty liver. And look at this, reversal to normal glucose tolerance was half of the other phenotypes. So presence of the fatty liver is impediment to the lifestyle intervention in patient with prediabetes, and in patient with diabetes, it is impediment to action of drugs. Presence of gestational diabetes. This is important because if there is a history of gestational diabetes, we should adequately counsel the patient that there is a very, very high chances of becoming diabetic in the future. This is a systemic review and meta-analysis of all the studies of gestational diabetes, and then subsequently they followed up for development of diabetes. And look at this, very high slope for development of diabetes, 5 years, and then up to 10 years, and after that there is a plateau. So early development diabetes after gestational diabetes is important, and hence in these patients, if there's a prevalence of pre-diabetes, then we should be very, very aggressive. And an Indian study also is available where the follow-up was 12 to 44 months. The dysglycemia was found to be 57.7%. This is from All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Diabetes in 10% and pre-diabetes is 47%. So this is the opportunity for reversal of diabetes if we are aggressive enough in this particular subset of people. Now, having gone through the factors where the evidence is available, let's look at some of the other factors where evidence is not so much, or we are talking a little presumptively. Family history of diabetes, first degree relative of patient with pre-diabetes. If relatives develop diabetes young, there are more chances. So family history of diabetes does definitely portend that these people may develop diabetes from pre-diabetes pretty early. Types of pre-diabetes, more difficult to regress with impaired fasting glucose. And BMI, the conversion rate was lower in patients with low than high BMI. And this we have discussed earlier also, that they may be low insulin secretor phenotype. Now, one unknown factor is pancreatic fat. So let's talk about some unknown factors. This is where our research focus currently is. Now look at this. These are pancreas fat, depiction of pancreas fat on magnetic resonance imaging in two group of people. Both are non-obese by BMI. Both are young. Look at this. 27 and 25 years of age, BMI 21, 21.9, body fat 29%, 27%. But one is diabetic, other is non-diabetic. And this is the volume of the pancreas. It is much bigger as far as diabetic patient, non-obese diabetic patient. So here obesity is not exactly a determinant. Even non-obese people may develop fatty pancreas. It's important to take away this fact from the liver and from the from the pancreas. We have discussed about liver, we have discussed about pancreas. Can we take away this fat? Can we decrease this fat? This is the early study, 2011. 9 years have gone by, and based on this, number of studies have been done. 11 obese patients with type 2 diabetes, 600 kilocalorie diet followed up at 1, 4, and 8 weeks. Only 8-week study, but beautifully done. And a study path-breaking. Look at the fasting blood glucose reversal in patients with diabetes. Fasting plasma glucose normalized within first week. Whatever be the 600 calorie diet, they used a sweetened 600 diet formula, liquid formula. So it was not without sugar. Look at the hepatic triglyceride. Hepatic triglyceride content decreased from 12% to 2.9% in 8 weeks. And pancreatic triglyceride content decreased from 8 to 6.2, only 1.8% reduction, and hepatic triglyceride 10% reduction, and diabetes was reversed within 8 weeks time. This was the early study for reversal of diabetes. Low insulin secretory genotype, we have already talked about. There are a number of genes which have been implicated. This is one gene, and we have already talked about the lean or non-obese people who may have low insulin secretion. Interesting area is excess fat over the chin or over dorsocervical region, and this may occur in a particular type of genetic lipodystrophy called Duchenne type of lipodystrophy, which is autosomal dominant. And you see that patient doesn't have, this is a female patient, doesn't have fat over abdomen or legs. There is none. And there is excess fat over the chin, double chin. Yeah. Whole neck is full of fat. There's no other fat elsewhere. Early diabetes is known to occur. And this is the lamin AC mutation in familial partial lipodystrophy. Of course, it determines many other diseases also. Now, we looked at this in normal people, not genetic lipodystrophy, but normal people. If there is excess fat deposition, so-called buffalo hump, or excess fat over the chin, doesn't mean anything. And we published that in Diabetes Research in Clinical Practice, that is highly correlated with presence of metabolic syndrome and prediabetes. This is seen in another patient here. Look at this, marked acanthosis nigricans, but huge amount of dorsocervical fat here. And finally, low ratio muscle mass and excess body fat. And we also, we knew about this, that this is occurring in the Indian body. But whether genetic factors are involved, we didn't know. And we looked at a gene, mutation of myostatin gene, which made a, this is a case report in NEGM. This child had myostatin gene mutation, huge muscles, Hercules child, huge muscles here versus normal child. We looked at the myostatin gene mutation, which we published in PLOS One sometime back. We looked at the not mutation, polymorphism, and a particular type of polymorphism in our cohort of patients led to decrease in the muscle mass and increase in the body fat. So a ratio of low muscle mass, sarcopenia versus high body fat portend that this phenotype may be difficult. So this is my last slide. Pre-diabetes is an important intermediate condition. Identifies those at risk for diabetes and coronary artery disease. Common in Indian population, and conversion to diabetes is rapid. And identification of difficult phenotype which may impede conversion of the pre-diabetes to normal glucose variation is important for application of aggressive lifestyle. If we are looking at 30 minutes of exercise, in these people, we look at 60 minutes of aerobic physical activity and more intense dietary precautions. And we look at quick remission. So pre-diabetes, quick remission within 1 month or 2 months, which gives them a chance for long-term remission. And if there is a fatty liver, that we can look at with the ultrasound, then we are more aggressive. And those who have fatty liver and no diabetes, we look for diabetes. And there's certainly more research which is required in other proposed phenotype like pancreatic fat, low muscle mass. etc. So thank you, Dr. Kasliwal, for giving me this opportunity to present some of our data and some of our thinking.
Thank you, sir, for that excellent presentation, telling us about the various phenotypes of pre-diabetes which could progress to diabetes. So it told us that it is pre-diabetes is real, it is common, but importantly, it is reversible. One can prevent the onset of diabetes or delay the onset of diabetes. Understand pre-diabetes also increases the risk of CKD. There's one question I just wanted to have your comments. And secondly, the relation of central or visceral fat along with pre-diabetes.
Okay. So it's like this, that patient who have pre-diabetes, except those who have a non-obese phenotype, most of them are obese, 80% are obese. And obesity combined with pre-diabetes definitely is at least associated with microalbuminuria as a part of metabolic syndrome. But also it has been shown in some studies that it may cause early glomerulosclerosis. So certainly kidney is one target, not often talked about, not often researched, but this is well known. As far as the intra-abdominal fat is concerned, which is so-called visceral fat, and in fact, before I coming here for this lecture, I was talking about the ectopic fat in various places in Indian population. The both subcutaneous abdominal fat and intra-abdominal fat both are important. Why subcutaneous is important? Is that subcutaneous fat is 3 times the mass of intra-abdominal fat. Intra-abdominal fat is just 2 kilos or 2.5 kilos. Subcutaneous fat is 8 to 9 kilos. Both secrete non-esterified fatty acids. So people talk about, well, this is visceral fat, you have more visceral fat, Indians have more visceral fat, and that's why they have more problems. No, they have increased fat everywhere. And visceral fat is one of them. So liver fat, pancreatic fat, subcutaneous fat, intra-abdominal fat, and possibly epicardial and pericardial fat as well. So all this together, they increase possibility of not only diabetes, cardiovascular disease also.
So you showed one slide, the pre-diabetes in the age group 25 to 44, the 3 groups. So should we screen earlier for pre-diabetes in Indian population?
Indian population, sir, as far as the Government of India guidelines are concerned, that everybody above age of 30 years should have at least a blood sugar estimation done. But this is often not done, of course. And if we have the blood sugar estimation above 30 years, then we'll identify some people with pre-diabetes, at least impaired fasting glucose, if not impaired glucose tolerance. But in those who have a family history of diabetes, early enough, premature diabetes, or family history of coronary artery disease, have family history of multiple cardiovascular risk factors, then I would probably do the blood sugar estimation early enough, maybe at 20, maybe at 25, depending on the situation.
Dr. Iyengar, may I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Dr. Anup, you remember many years ago we worked on flow-mediated vasodilatation in early diabetic patients. Do you think, just based on the tremendous data that you've presented, that this thing should be scaled up? Because pre-diabetes already, there is atherosclerosis already started in the pre-diabetic phase. So a thing like flow-mediated vasodilatation abnormalities, or looking at carotid femoral atherosclerosis may take us a long way. And of course, you've already said that, and this is a good new concept of doing lifestyle management and then getting a remission. So I think preclinical atherosclerosis and preclinical and pre-diabetes walk hand in hand. What do you think?
Absolutely, I totally agree with you, and you are the master in that. So, but I will express some of my thoughts based on the lecture I just took. I think, Dr. Kasliwal, you and your team are in eminent position to do some further studies on flow-mediated vasodilation or similar other surrogate markers in patients with pre-diabetes in different situations. So just not pre-diabetes. You've seen it's a heterogeneous entity. So,
Right.
so for example, let me give you an idea. Those with a F1 fibrosis on fibroscan in the liver and have pre-diabetes versus no fibrosis on fibroscan. And I can tell you, you will find more problems, endothelial relaxation problem, atherosclerosis in those people who have a liver problem. So I think we have to choose one of the phenotypes, compare with the usual pre-diabetes and look at things. And you will find many abnormalities. And you are absolutely right that in those people, if we find the abnormality, we have to be very aggressive as far as lifestyle intervention or maybe metformin is concerned. Now, our current view of metformin is very old. You know, you give to those people who body mass index is this, who cannot walk, who have gestational diabetes and so on. But I think this thinking must change, and this thinking should change with further studies on the phenotype.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kasliwal.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah. So we had an excellent talk on two topics of great preventive cardiology interest. And we had excellent talks by Dr. Professor Anup Mishra and Dr. Manish. I thank both of them and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody. This was amazing. And there was so much to learn today. There was so much to learn. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.